mumbling on anyhow. We'll wait a couple of minutes.
Yeah. It was a real small crowd at the first service today, too.
If I can ask you a question before we get started.
Yeah, sure.
The Kenites.
I'm sorry.
The Kenites in the Old Testament.
Yes.
From what I understand, they were descended from Cain.
Well,
Or
yeah.
how did that work? How did they get past the flood?
I'm trying to remember the Talmudic commentary. In reality, the word itself, the Kenites were metalsmiths,
Mm-hmm.
metalworkers. That's the origins of the name. And remember that Noah is seen in some ways as a new Adam. I mean, that theme would reoccur in Paul with Christ and the new. But the rabbis, the Talmudic commentary, which begins in Babylon, the Babylonian Talmud, tended to see this kind of start over as exactly that, as God rebooting creation. So they probably would have argued, although I have to honestly tell you, I don't, without going and looking at the Talmud, I don't remember the arguments for that. It is they who credited the Canaanite with Cain.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not, they were all cousins.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just, and the conquest of the Holy Lands was an inside job.
Mm-hmm.
One of my old professors used to say, gentlemen, if there were 600,000 men, when the front touched the Holy Lands, the back would have still been. So probably, that's one of the great embarrassments to scholars,
Mm-hmm.
that there is no outside documentation of the Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
And if it had been a massive slave rebellion, that would have made the Egyptian annals.
Yeah.
The best guess, I think, of most of us is that we're probably talking about a kind of ragtag crowd of 2,000-3,000, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, no, the remember also that those stories, those first 11 chapters of Genesis, are very late. They go to the time of Babylon. I mean, I'm convinced, you get 5 Old Testament scholars together, you got about 10 opinions, but I'm convinced that the Jews came out of Babylon with Torah.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't go into it with Torah, as we know, the 5 books of Moses. I mean, there are certainly writings that predate that, but all right. Well, we shall begin. By the way, much of what I'm doing is from a book by Philip Yancey called Vanishing Grace. Yancey, you may know, is a Christian journalist, and I don't mean by that he reports on things Christian. He is also a Christian, I should say that, but he is a religious journalist. He's written several books, all of which are good. I told you last week that we would begin to speak about the question of God. Is there somebody out there? Is there, to use a term that's familiar to a lot of people, is there a higher power? Is there something governing the universe? In the world in which most of you grew up, and certainly I grew up, the answer was unequivocally yes. There might be a lot of difference of opinion about what that meant or how that played out. But by and large, when I was young, in the Dark Ages, everybody went to church. It is my suspicion that it was something like patriotism on 9/11. I remember my wife telling me, everybody's getting patriotic. I said, Marianne, it's 10 miles wide and a 16th of an inch deep. I suspect that was true after the war in the 50s. I always remember that I had a colleague of mine who's a Presbyterian minister who started his ministry in the middle of the war in New Alex, you will know, New Alexander, which is a little country crossroads. Like many of those parishes, he had a Wednesday night prayer meeting. Bill said during the war, there were 100 people every Wednesday night at prayer meeting. After V-Day, there were about 15. A lot of religion, and all primitive religion, works on cause, cure. And that sort of religion was certainly on offer when Christianity made its way into the world. So there are a lot of people who believe in God when God is the only recourse. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about God, the concept of the Almighty, as a means by which one begins to interpret the world. One of the greatest problems we have, I think, is that we forget that people who practice Islam in all of its variant forms tend to be religious in the true sense of the word, that it filters their worldview. Even in the world in which I grew up in, what a speaker, when we still had things like biblical colloquies, back before computers. We had one to which I was, we had to be invited. They were presenting some major papers, and one of the fellows who was a presenter said, for most of us, most of our people live life as virtual atheists. Now, he did not mean that church people were all bad and that they came to church and, played at piety and then went out and did evil things. What he meant was that the worldview that we have when we worship is not necessarily the worldview that guides the rest of the week for us. True religion of any sort is about how one understands the world. That's why the God question is important. True atheists, people who are serious about atheism, do not dance on the grave of God. Because it means it's just you and me. And I'm not real sure How about you? Voltaire once said, whom I dearly, I think Voltaire was the greatest person of the whole Enlightenment. Voltaire said, you know, the Jesuits taught me to prove anything, thus believe nothing. But Voltaire said, yes, I want my lawyer, my banker, my butcher, indeed my wife, to believe in God, because there's way less chance I'll be robbed or cuckolded. You can't have a legitimate morality without some higher authority. In the end, there has to be an absolute. But we live in a world which goes something like this. According to Yancey, this was running around the internet. He would know, I would have no idea, because I try to avoid those things like the plug. One weekend, this paragraph ranked as the most popular post on Google's social network. This book, by the way, was done in 2014. Philosophy is like being in a dark room and looking for a black cat. Metaphysics is like being in a dark room and looking for a black cat that isn't there. Theology is like being in a dark room, looking for a black cat that isn't there and shouting, I found it! And science is like being in a dark room, looking for a black cat using a flashlight. Ever since the Enlightenment, in fact, probably the whole focus of the Enlightenment was science, the scientific theory. And early on, this country, in fact, most of the Western world, and religion and science could commingle, they could mesh. Once Darwin came along, things began to separate. Darwin opened up a Pandora's box. Not because evolution is necessarily wrong. That is, certainly certain species evolve. That's indisputable. Even the virus evolves. That's all those variants are about. But when you argue from the particular to the general, you're liable to make an error. The problem with Darwin forward is more and more we forgot to teach kind of classical thought, deduction, induction, what is and isn't provable. And so people, because it was science, make great leaps of faith. I mean, we are living in the last 2 years of what I would call the tyranny of science. Isn't that science doesn't have anything important to say, or there isn't things we can get from it that are helpful. I mean, science has done a lot of wonderful things. But even the scientists, the best of them by their own admission, say the chances of the world coming into existence without some outside force is 10 to the 60th power. Now that's way beyond my ken as far as mathematics goes. but it's got to be a big number. 10 to the 60th power. Stephen Hawking has said that if the Big Bang were off by an infinite, some sort of millisecond, nanosecond, the whole universe would have collapsed before it even got started. Sometimes, I have a friend of mine who's a Methodist parson. We were colleagues in Somerset. And Art, among other things, has a master's in chemistry. And a very fine scholar and a good guy. As you may know, the Methodist liturgy, at least the original Methodist liturgy, is not terribly far removed from ours, which should surprise no one since, Charles and John were Anglican priests. Art and I, with a couple of colleagues, we have what I call the Holy Club. We got together once a month, and it was like a minor chapter. And I always, because I had Mass on Wednesday mornings early, said Mass for the group. And Art said to me one time, I have a terrible time with angels and archangels and all the company of heaven. Well, about a month before, he had given me Hawking's A Short History of Time, which I literally waded through it. It's not my normal reading. I said, Art, do you believe this guy? Oh, absolutely. He said he's on a cutting edge. I said, so you think he's... He said, yes, of course I believe him. I said, you have trouble with angels and archangels and all the company of heaven? Mythology, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, is mythology, whether it's wrapped in scientific language or genuinely religious, cultic language. Science can, and in some instances has, become a cult. There are all kinds of other answers on offer. There's all the kind of New Age stuff, and I understand witchcraft is back. Some of it's good and some of it's bad. I'm not sure how you decide which is which. But so there are a lot. Mostly, it is what one of my old professors said many, many years ago. In fact, it was the 60s. And Bruce T. Riley said, gentlemen, most people's religion is a lot of folklore with a thin, and I do mean thin, veneer of doctrine. I mean, we had a Presbyterian colleague when we lived in McDonald who said, when I began, there was in almost every Presbyterian church a buck elder who, if you strayed too far from the tenets of Calvinism, could call you back and call you on it. Ed said, now, this was the 80s, Ed said, now I could get in the pulpit, preach whatever I want, and nobody'd even know it was heresy. And believe me, I know that's true in the Episcopal Church, because a lot of what passed for doctrine was in fact heresy, which means one with another opinion. So it makes a difference not only whether we believe in a higher power, but in fact who that higher power is, and how we define it, and how we understand it. Christianity came out of a religion which had a very definite understanding of who God is. That God had revealed himself to his people on Sinai. Torah is the revelation of God. It's not just a set of rules about being good so we can go to heaven. 3/4 of the Jews probably didn't believe in heaven. And the other quarter believed in the resurrection. And a crude view it was at that. But they believed God was the God of the Jews and that God intended to redeem the world through them. It is the only way Christianity makes sense. Because suddenly, in Jesus Christ, a small group began to realize that what God had said would happen at the end of time happened in the middle of time. And that was the Christian message. Jesus Christ is Lord. That in Jesus there is a new and complete revelation of who God is and what God's doing. And that the incarnation was seen first at the cross and at the empty tomb. The predominant gospel story is the passion narrative. So that early Christianity, not by its theology, but by its living, proclaimed to the world that God was doing something different than anybody expected. The early Christians converted Rome piece by piece by the way in which they lived. They fed the poor. Everybody's poor. They tended the sick, even in the midst of plagues, even if the plague killed them. My biggest criticism of the church in the last 2 years is the ungodly fear with which we have lived. It's just telling, at least old men, about what it is we really believe. I'm not talking about taking undue chances or just, being ridiculous. On the other hand, there are plenty of examples, even within our own tradition, and even in America, of priests of this church who were doctors, who tended the sick through yellow fever epidemics and those sorts, until they died. Because they believed that's what they were called to do. I don't think they wanted to die. That would be too weird. But they understood. There's this wonderful story of Polycarp, 83 years old, tied to the stake, about to be burned, and the town official who loved Polycarp, please just offer a pinch of incense to the emperor, deny Jesus. And Polycarp said, I can't. You see, Christian martyrdom was always never about destroying other people, but about witnessing to the love of God. We understood, because of who Jesus was and what he did, that God so loved the world. It always has to start at the top. It's not you and me, Jesus. That's real enough. But when we talk about a personal God, we don't talk about a God we own. We talk about a God who owns us. And those are two very different things. In cause cure, in primitive religion, it's always about manipulating the deity. Whereas Christianity understands God as running the world, and therefore running me, whether I like it or not, whether I want it or not. You know, I like to think that I'm a good American. I believe in free choice and all those sorts of things. Except when it comes to God, you can't vote on God. Just because you say, I don't believe in God, and that may affect you personally, it may make your life miserable, it may give you little or no hope, but it doesn't nullify the divine. This is not like Alice and the Jabberwocky. I don't believe, I don't believe, I don't believe. It just isn't. If God is, then he is. And if he is, who at least we believe God to be, both by revelation of Scripture and by the revelation of Jesus himself, then he is in charge. There is no such thing as democratic Christianity. Voting against God does not nullify him. Nor does it end the fact that the world is his. It's probably the most important thing. Religion in this country in particular, but perhaps in the whole Western world, made a pact with the devil. If you let me believe what I want to believe, I will not interfere with the larger scope of life. It'll be just you and me, Jesus. And I will love him, and he will love me, and I'll eventually flow into the heavenlies. But I'll try to be quiet about it. That's never been God's intention. Because his intention, at least according to Scripture, was to redeem creation. Richard and I were just talking before about the flood. The flood is about God's continuing attempt to redeem creation. The mistake, and I come back to something I've said many times, I'm an Anglican because I think we're one of the few people who understand the fall. Man's very far gone from original righteousness. We are not, any of us, what God intended us to be. That does not mean we subverted the will of God. It means that, like little children, we are very willful. If you don't believe in original sin, go to a nursery. me. Or watch my duck. It's the same. So we really need to make sure not only that we say we believe in God, but that we're clear about our understanding of who God is and what God's doing. Because if we're not, then the question which comes next, why are we here, doesn't really have a very good answer. The problem for modernity, or postmodernity, if there is such a thing, is that it doesn't have really good answers to those kinds of questions, because it doesn't have a firm concept of who God is. And frankly, some of the blame has to come from the Christian church, because we simply stopped preaching the message. It's clear enough. It's not opaque. It doesn't, you don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be a scholar. That Bart said to somebody one time, somebody said, "Oh, Dr. Bart, nobody understands more about Christianity than you do." Bart looked at him and said, "The cleaning woman understands more about Christianity than I do." And there's a great truth in that. Because it's about how life is lived. It's about how we interact with the world around us. And that can only be directed by having a proper understanding of who God is. Not just that there is a God. There are, over my lifetime as a clergyman, I have had innumerable people say to me, "Well, I believe in God." And I always say to them, "I bet God's impressed." God requires us to believe in Him because it makes a difference in who we are. Everybody's willing to call Jesus Savior because we all want saved. But very few are willing to call Him Lord. Because that means I must do what He wants done. And oftentimes, I simply don't want to do that. You cannot expect God to redesign the world for you, because He's not going to do it. There are things that God does for each of us. I think we have, for lack of a better term, a guardian angel. I think there are things we have no idea about. In doing some of the mock-up of this and research, you remember at the end of Ephesians, Paul writes to Ephesus, "We fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and evil forces." So Bill Barclay's commentary is right next to my easy chair. Remember, Barclay wrote in the late 50s and early 60s, a great Reformed scholar. Pulled out his commentary on Ephesians, flipped to it, partly because I wanted to see his translation. I read his commentary and I thought, well, yeah. Because he wanted to say, oh, no, we're all too sophisticated to believe it. Yeah, that's how they thought in the first century. And I'm going, Barclay, we fight against powers and forces. Demons are real. You can call them anything you want, but in the ancient world, demons were responsible for disorder. And if you think there aren't powers greater than you and I, then you must have had a very different life experience than I had, where you're whistling in the cemetery. Of course there are forces greater than I am. Of course there are things that wish to separate me from God. Otherwise, the cross would be superfluous. And my Orthodox friends think that we in the West are way too taken with the suffering of Jesus. And in some respects, they're probably correct. But his suffering was redemptive. It wasn't to appease the anger of God. That's the worst theology. It just makes me shudder. It's a theology by way which I grew up with. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now. Christ's suffering on the cross was redemptive. It was for my salvation and for yours. Not to appease the anger of an angry God, but so that we would have the ability to fight against the forces of death and evil. So that Paul can say in Romans, O death, where is thy victory? Grave, where is, O grave, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? That's the miraculous beginnings of the good news. Who for us men, and for our salvation, who for all of humanity came down from heaven, dwelt among us, and offered his life a ransom for many. Next week, why are we here? So that we can be a continuation of the redemption.
Thank you. Josh?
What did we? Oh. Well, as my grandfather said, it went down from preaching to meddling.
Yeah, it was right.
It says my grandfather said it went down from preaching to meddling.
Because Kathy Harris asked on Facebook how Eddie's face was.
I think it's trampoline flew and broke his gate or something like that, he was saying.
Okay.
Kathy's mother's house had a big tree come down right across the road.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, big old oak.
They're saving it up for turkey.
Yeah, that whole
Now, he came across the street in Washington County.
Let me give you my best quick.
And he got right around him.
But in Buffalo Township,
The church
Washington County.
using it for work, the barn or put it on.
Yeah.